My name is Diane Whitfield, and 3 weeks after I buried my husband, I found $55 million hidden in a bank account his own family swore didn't exist. They stood in my living room in their black funeral clothes and told me, with straight faces, that Richard died broke. That the business was drowning in debt. That I should be grateful they were even letting me keep the house. I believed them. I had no reason not to. Grief makes you stupid that way. It hollows you out until you'll swallow anything just to make the pain stop asking questions. But grief also makes you careless, and careless people leave things behind. Richard left behind a single key, taped under the bottom drawer of his study desk, and that key was about to blow my entire life apart. I want to start at the beginning, because you need to understand who these people were before I tell you what they did. Richard and I were married for 18 years. He was 51 when the heart attack took him, sudden and cruel, in the parking lot of the pharmacy on a Tuesday afternoon in March. 1 minute he was texting me a picture of a bag of oranges, joking that he'd finally found the good kind, and 40 minutes later a stranger was performing CPR on him on the asphalt while I was still at work, completely unaware that my entire world had already ended. Richard came from money, or what looked like money. His family, the Whitfields, ran a mid-sized logistics and freight company that his father had built from a single truck in the 1970s. By the time I met Richard, the company had grown into something with real weight in 3 states, and the family wore that weight like a crown. His mother, Eleanor, was the kind of woman who corrected your grammar at dinner and called it helping. His older brother, Preston, had taken over as CEO when their father passed, and he ran that company the way he ran everything else in his life, like it belonged to him and him alone, and everyone else was simply permitted to stand nearby. I was never truly accepted into that family. I came from a small town 2 hours outside the city. My father drove a delivery truck for 30 years, and no matter how many galas I attended or how graciously I smiled through Eleanor's backhanded compliments, I was always Richard's wife, never quite a Whitfield. I told myself it didn't matter. I had Richard. He loved me fiercely and openly, in a way that made the coldness of his family feel almost irrelevant. We built a life outside of them, in a house he insisted we buy with money that had nothing to do with the family business, because, in his words, I don't want anything of ours to owe them anything. At the time, I thought that was just Richard being independent. I didn't understand. It was a man quietly building a wall between his life and theirs, brick by brick, for reasons he never told me. When he died, the family moved fast. Too fast, looking back. Within a week of the funeral, Preston called a meeting at the family estate, not a phone call, not a conversation over coffee, but an actual scheduled meeting, like I was a vendor being informed of a contract termination. Eleanor sat at the head of the table because apparently grief doesn't interrupt hierarchy. Preston slid a folder across to me and told me, gently enough that it almost sounded kind, that Richard's personal finances were a mess. That he'd made some bad investments in the last few years. That the life insurance would cover the mortgage and give me something to live on, but beyond that, there simply wasn't much left. He never wanted you to worry about money, Eleanor said, patting my hand like she was doing me a favor. So he handled things quietly. We're just sorry it turned out this way. I remember nodding. I remember actually thanking them, for their honesty. I drove home that night and cried in my car in the driveway for 40 minutes, because on top of losing my husband, I now believed I'd lost the life we'd built too. I started making lists. What I'd have to sell. Whether I could keep the house. Whether I'd need to go back to my mother's old advice and pick up extra shifts at the clinic where I worked as an office manager. It was around week 3, while I was finally forcing myself to clean out his study, his sanctuary, the room that still smelled like his cologne and old paper, that I found the key. It was taped to the underside of the bottom drawer, wrapped in a small strip of masking tape with a single word written on it in his handwriting, Diane. Not a name of a bank. Not a number. Just my name, like he knew exactly who would eventually find it, and exactly when. The key had no markings, no bank logo, nothing to tell me what it opened. I almost dismissed it as nothing, an old key to a shed, a forgotten padlock. But something about the way it was hidden, deliberately, carefully, taped where no casual search would ever find it, made my stomach twist. Richard didn't hide things. In 18 years of marriage, if anything, his flaw was that he shared too much. This felt different. This felt like a message from a man who knew he might not get the chance to explain himself in person. I spent 2 days going through every drawer, every folder, every box in that study looking for something that matched the key. And then, tucked inside an old owner's manual for a car we didn't even own anymore, I found a folded piece of paper with an address on it, a private banking office downtown, one of those quiet institutions with no storefront, no ATM, just a brass nameplate and a locked door you need an appointment to walk through. I called. I gave them Richard's name, my name, and the situation. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped, and then a very careful voice asked me to come in person, with identification and Richard's death certificate. I sat in that lobby for 20 minutes before a woman named Ms. Alvarez called me back to her office. She was polite in the practiced way of someone trained to deliver difficult news without changing her expression. She asked for the key. She asked for my ID. She typed for what felt like an eternity, and then she turned her monitor slightly toward me and said the words that split my life into a clean before and after. Mrs. Whitfield, your husband held a private trust account with this institution. The current balance, including investment holdings, is a little over $55 million. You are listed as the sole beneficiary. I want to tell you I had some composed, elegant reaction. I didn't. I laughed. A short, sharp, disbelieving laugh, because my brain simply refused to process the number. $55 million. The family that told me Richard died broke, the family that made me feel like a charity case at my own kitchen table, had been sitting 3 feet away from that number and said nothing. Or worse, they didn't know. Which meant Richard had hidden this from all of them, not just me. Ms. Alvarez slid a folder across the desk. Inside were account statements going back almost 11 years. 11 years. This wasn't a sudden windfall. This was a fortune Richard had been quietly building, moving, protecting for over a decade, years before his father even passed, years before Preston took over the company. And tucked at the very back of that folder was a sealed envelope with my name on it, in Richard's handwriting, the ink slightly faded like it had been sitting there for a long, long time. I didn't open it in that office. I couldn't. I drove home with it sitting on the passenger seat like it was a live thing, and I sat at our kitchen table, the same table where his family had told me he died with nothing, and I opened it with shaking hands. What was inside changed everything I thought I knew about my marriage, and it explained, in brutal and precise detail, exactly why my husband had built a wall of silence around this money. Richard wrote that 11 years earlier, he discovered something about the family business that he wasn't supposed to find. A pattern of falsified freight manifests. Underreported revenue funneled into shell accounts Preston controlled. Money skimmed off government contracts meant for infrastructure logistics, the kind of fraud that doesn't just cost money, it costs trust, jobs, sometimes lives when corners get cut on safety compliance to hide the paper trail. Richard had gone to his father first, quietly, hoping it could be handled inside the family. His father, aging and unwilling to believe his golden son capable of it, had done nothing. And Preston, once he found out Richard knew, had made something very clear to him in a private conversation Richard documented word for word in that letter. Stay quiet, take your share, or lose everything, including your marriage. Because Preston controlled the family trust that technically owned the house we lived in at the time. Richard didn't fight him publicly. He did something smarter. He began quietly extracting his rightful share of family assets he was legally entitled to: dividends, inherited stock, an early buyout of his ownership stake, funneling it into an account completely separate from the family's reach, under an institution with strict privacy protections, naming only me. At the same time, he began documenting everything. Every fraudulent manifest. Every falsified number. Every conversation. He was building a case, slowly and patiently, not just to protect our future, but to eventually expose what Preston had done to the company's board, to federal regulators, to the family itself. He wrote that he was terrified of what would happen if the family found the money before he was ready to make his move, because Preston had shown he was capable of cruelty when threatened. So Richard protected it the only way he knew how, total secrecy, even from me, because, in his words, you can't accidentally reveal what you don't know, Diane. I needed you safe more than I needed you informed. The letter ended with an apology and an instruction. He'd hired a forensic accountant and an attorney years earlier, both bound by confidentiality, both aware of exactly what to do if he passed before he could act himself. Their names and numbers were in the envelope. He told me the money was mine to do whatever I wanted with, but the evidence, the documentation, the 11 years of proof, that was mine to finish if I had it in me. I sat at that table until the sun came up. I won't pretend I wasn't tempted to simply take the money and disappear into a quiet, comfortable life far away from all of them. God knows I'd earned the right to walk away. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Eleanor patting my hand like I was a stray they'd taken pity on. I saw Preston sliding that folder across the table with his rehearsed, sorrowful face, while he sat on knowledge that could have destroyed him. They hadn't just lied to me about money. They had used my grief as a weapon, banking on the fact that a broken widow wouldn't ask hard questions. They miscalculated badly, because grief broke me open, but it also stripped away every reason I had left to be polite. I called the attorney first. His name was Marcus Feld, and he'd apparently been waiting 11 years for this exact phone call. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't even particularly surprised that I hadn't known. He simply said, "Mrs. Whitfield, your husband built you an insurance policy. I think it's time we use it." Over the next 2 months, working with Marcus and the forensic accountant, Richard's documentation was compiled into something airtight: years of manifests cross-referenced against actual shipping records, bank transfers traced through 3 shell companies, and Preston's own voice on an old recorded phone call Richard had kept, threatening him if he ever spoke up. It was, according to Marcus, one of the cleanest fraud cases he'd seen in 20 years of practice, largely because Richard hadn't been sloppy or emotional about it. He'd built it like an engineer builds a bridge, quietly, methodically, load-bearing from every angle, so it couldn't collapse under pressure. I made one decision that I'm still proud of, even now. I didn't go to the press first. I didn't go to Preston in a screaming confrontation, even though God knows I wanted to. I called a family meeting of my own at the same estate, at the same table, and I asked Eleanor and Preston to sit down because I had something to discuss about Richard's estate. They came in expecting a grieving widow asking for a little more help. Eleanor even brought a casserole, which felt almost cruelly funny in hindsight. I let Marcus do most of the talking. I watched Preston's face change in real time as Marcus laid out, document by document, exactly what Richard had uncovered 11 years earlier and exactly what would happen if this information reached the board and federal regulators the following Monday. I watched Eleanor's hand freeze halfway to her water glass when she realized her golden son had been lying not just to me, but to her, for over a decade, and that she'd spent the last month participating in a lie about a dead man's finances to squeeze a grieving widow out of what was rightfully hers. I gave Preston 2 options. He could resign quietly, sign over his controlling shares to restructure the company under independent oversight, and personally repay the misappropriated funds through a settlement that would keep this out of criminal court. Or Marcus would file everything with the board and the appropriate federal agency on Monday morning, and Preston could explain fraud and embezzlement to a jury instead of to me. He tried, of course, to charm his way out of it first. Then he tried anger, the same tone he'd probably used to intimidate Richard 11 years earlier. It didn't work on me the way it worked on his brother, because I had nothing left to protect. I'd already lost the only thing that scared me, Richard. Everything after that was just paperwork. He signed. Eleanor didn't say a word through any of it, which told me everything I needed to know about where her loyalty had always actually lived. I didn't take everything from them, though I could have. Marcus advised me that pursuing full criminal charges would have been within my rights and likely successful, but I made a choice Richard would have understood, because in the letter he never once talked about revenge, only about protecting me and eventually telling the truth. So the settlement restructured the company under contracts and the husband walked away with his freedom, but we still remember Eleanor lost her seat at the head of every family she ever presided over, because without Preston's money and the power behind him, her influence simply evaporated. That, it turns out, was its own kind of justice. Watching someone who built her entire identity on control with knowledge, not through violence, but through the simple, unstoppable arrival. As for me, I kept the $55 million budget and spent 11 years quietly protecting him, and I used part of it to do something he would have wanted. I funded an independent compliance and whistleblower protection foundation in his name, so that the next person who discovers something they weren't supposed to find is somewhere safer to turn than a locked drawer and a hidden key. I still think about that key sometimes, taped under the drawer with my name written on it in his handwriting. I think about how much trust and how much love it takes for a man to spend over a decade quietly building a fortress around the people he loves, brick by silent brick, never once asking for credit, never once breaking under the threats of his own family. Richard didn't just leave me money. He left me the truth and the strength to use it at exactly the moment I needed both the most. His family said he died broke. What he actually left behind was $55 million, 11 years of quiet courage, and enough truth to burn down every lie they ever told about him and about me. They should have known better than to underestimate a grieving woman with nothing left to lose.